whenever you seek to define or to exercise freedom or choice apart from these God-ordained limits, you quickly realize you yourself become enslaved to your own passions, your own desires, your sin nature, and you move in the direction, as a people or a nation, you move in the direction of tyranny. Hi, friends. This is Scott Allen, president of the Disciple Nations Alliance, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Ideas Have Consequences, the podcast of the Disciple Nations Alliance. As we prepare to launch my newest book, 10 Words to Heal Our Broken World, Restoring the True Meaning of Our Most Important Words, we wanted to go through each one of these 10 foundational words that are highlighted in the book, discussing their true meaning, as well as how they've been fundamentally redefined in our contemporary culture. Now, you might be asking, why do words matter? Well, it's because words and definitions shape the way we think and feel, and that in turn determines our choices and our actions. And that shapes the kind of culture that we live in, for better or for worse. And so, if you want to work for a positive change in culture, in society, it has to begin by restoring the true meaning of our most important words.
Hi, friends. I know my dad already greeted you, but just wanted to say again, thank you so much for joining us here on Ideas Have Consequences. We are all so grateful that you've chosen to listen to this podcast. We love watching the way that this podcast has continued to reach a greater and greater audience worldwide. Just this morning, I was looking at some of the numbers, and I noticed that we have 20 new listeners in Ireland, 18 new listeners in Ghana, 17 people in Sweden listening, hi people from Sweden, and 17 people in Singapore. So we are so thankful for you guys deciding to listen to Ideas Have Consequences. We hope you enjoy the show. For those of you who are new to the show, my name is Luke Allen, and I will be your host today. I am joined by my colleagues here at the DNA, and for the sake of the podcast, my co-host today, Darryl Miller and John Bottomore. Thanks for joining, guys.
Good to be here.
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
Yeah, great to have you guys. And once again today, my dad, Scott Allen, the author of the upcoming book, 10 Words to Heal Our Broken World, Restoring the True Meanings of Our Most Important Words, will be the interviewee for the sake of the discussion. And if you're wondering what those 10 words are, they are as follows: truth, human, sex, marriage, freedom, authority, justice, faith, beauty, and love. Such important words. So for this series, we have been just going through one word at a time. So today is episode 6, and as such, we are going to be unpacking the important word of freedom. As always, at the beginning of these discussions, Dad, if you could just lay out for us the biblical definition as you share it in the book, and then line that up with the contemporary, more commonly used modern definition. So, why don't we start there?
Yeah, well, it's great to be here with you, Luke, and with Darrow and John. I know both of you guys care deeply about this subject, and so I'm excited to get into it with you as well. In the book, I define true freedom this way. It's the capacity to self-govern, to act according to one's choices within God's created order and under His moral law. And then I go on and I essentially read it. I give the counterfeit or the redefinition of freedom that, again, is dominant in our culture today. I define it this way: it's the power or the right to act, speak, and think as one wants without hindrance or restraint. And essentially, it's the redefined freedom is a freedom that makes no reference to God, His created order, His moral law. It's this right to choose, and as we get into it, without any kind of constraint, as we get into it, we'll see that actually is not freedom. that the Bible is very clear about that being a form of slavery, and that's the condition that we're in. So,
Scott, what are some of the key aspects of this true definition that need to be pointed out to the audience?
Sure. Well, thanks, Darryl. I think there's two. There's two, and they have to go together. I think at the core or the essence of freedom, it's the ability to make choices. think about it in terms of the difference between human beings and animals. Animals don't make free choices. They function according to instinct, or they are governed. If you're a farm animal, let's say, or a dog or something, you've got a master that kind of dictates what you do. The opposite of freedom, too, is if you can think of somebody who's imprisoned, they make almost no choices. They don't choose when to get up, when to go to bed, what to eat. All those choices are made by somebody else. So at the core of freedom is this kind of idea of choosing. It's this freedom to make choices and to be responsible for the outcome of those choices as well. I think the second thing that has to go together with the first thing is that because we live in God's world and under His rule, to be free, you have to live within those limits or the constraints that He's established at creation. And you see this right away in Genesis chapter 1. You see both aspects. In fact, some of the very first words that God speaks to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden are amazingly, actually, you are free. I just want people to pause and think about how important that is, that God created us free. He said, you are free to Adam and Eve. And just to back up just a quick second on that, too, we are free as human beings because that's part of what it means to be made in God's image, actually. That's a kind of a fundamental aspect of what it means to be made in the image of God, because God Himself is free. In other words, nobody constrains God. He does what He wills. He acts according to His sovereign choices. But yet even there's a limit, and that limit for God is His own moral character, His holiness and His righteousness, which is perfect. So the Bible says it's impossible for God to lie. He can't choose to deceive or lie. That goes against His own character. That's the limit, even on God. So we're made in God's image. He says because He's free, we're free. We're not like the animals. We have this freedom to choose. It's essential to our task. But then He goes on and immediately says, you are free to eat of any of the trees of the garden except, right? the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so there you see the choice. You can choose to eat any of these fruits from this, magnificent garden. But there's that limit, except this one. So you see both of those right away, Darrow, I think. And I think both of those have to be said about true freedom. So
I think there's something else important to say right at this exact point. There is a choice to be made, and we can even choose to say no to God. That is how free we are. And I think that was established, your point of in the garden, our freedom was established, and it was established at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And you can eat of all the trees, but not this one. And that meant that our freedom is real freedom.
Real freedom, and God respects it. Yeah, that's right.
He respects it. We're not puppets. Yep. It's not an illusionary freedom.
Machines,
and we can say no to God, which just blows the
mind. And why
mind.
did God establish limits? This is where freedom gets kind of deep, and I think it's simply because we're not God. We live, and in that sense, we all ultimately we all serve something. There is no. This false freedom that we're going to get into is this illusion that we can there is no God and we can do whatever we please. But the Bible is very clear that if you believe that, you fall into a trap, and that trap is the trap of slavery, actually. It's slavery to Satan or sin and Satan, and that bondage leads to death and destruction. You completely lose freedom. So, this freedom that God gives us, there's a limit on it because we're not God, and to act as if that's actually the deception. The deception that Satan makes in the garden is the deception around this kind of false freedom. You can be like God, knowing good from evil. In other words, you don't need to be under God. You can be God. That's a lie. Satan knows that lie. This is his ploy, that if he can make them eat, essentially from that tree, reject that limit, he will enslave them, and he will destroy them. And that's the story of mankind post-fall, essentially.
And that's God's loving gift, isn't it? Like a parent who gives a child freedom to go outside and play, that says don't run across the street with busy cars playing. There are conditions to that freedom that demonstrate the parent's love, and God does the same thing. And for instance, in John 8:32, God says, if you abide in my word, so here's the initial condition. If you obey, if you abide in my word, you're my disciples, and you will know the truth. And what's the result of that? The truth will set you free. So that condition of abiding and obeying him are the wonderful God's guardrails that we can live with true freedom under if we first stay within God's guardrails and have wonderful and beautiful freedom outcomes, as opposed to thinking our ways are somehow going to lead to true freedom. They're not. They're bondage.
It would be good, I think, to talk about this a little later, because I know there's some other things you want to talk about first, Scott. But what is the root of freedom? It's truth. And I think it'd be good to come back to this passage later on. But one of the things in our podcast, we always say that if you want to change a culture, you need to first change the language. And Scott, how does the language of freedom, the word freedom, shape a culture?
Well, the freedom is such a fundamentally biblical idea. In fact, I would argue that apart from the Bible, there is no other worldview that gives any kind of basis for freedom. Yeah, and I know this is not exactly the answer to your question, Darrow, about how freedom shapes a culture, but maybe just quickly on this, I just think it's so important. There's a couple of conditions that are required for freedom, okay, for it to even exist. And it actually is really a rare thing in our in our fallen world. Politically, most countries are forms of tyranny of some sort or another. There's very limited freedom. To have freedom, you have to have a God-given right, essentially, to freedom, or as our founding fathers said, the right to life and to liberty. Those are God-given rights in the sense that nobody has a right to enslave me or you. Nobody has a right to do that. God created us with this right to be free people. And I think another condition that the Bible provides for freedom that's required or necessary is the rule of law. There has to be a higher law. That's a limit, if you will. But apart from that, you just have the rule of man, or the rule of the most powerful, and that's, of course, just tyranny. And the Bible is the only worldview, right, that provides those two kind of twin foundations. There may be more things, but just think about secular materialism for a second. First of all, there is no God. There's no God-given right to freedom. You have two problems with it in terms of freedom. One is, just this biological determinism. It's just matter in motion, right? We don't actually make free choices, in the sense that we don't, our choices are biologically determined, if you will, or materially determined. And then secondly, it's if you kind of start with this Darwinian idea, it's the law of the survival of the fittest, might makes right. It's the rule of the most powerful. So you don't have freedom in that worldview context. You don't have freedom in an animistic context where you have powerful, gods and demons and ancestors that kind of constrain all choice. You don't make free choices within that framework. And Marxism, actually, it's interesting. I've been doing a lot of, refreshing my thinking on Marxism these days, and You hear this amongst the woke people in our own country. They view freedom very negatively and critically. They see it's a tool of oppressors. It's this kind of false idea that oppressors use to oppress their victims. So there isn't a value for freedom, which is why we're losing freedom of speech. There's huge debates in our culture right now about the freedom of speech, and we're seeing such a huge shift around that right now as we move away from the biblical framework to the postmodern and Marxist framework, where people are quite fine with, censorship and constraints on people's freedom. You just move in the direction of tyranny. So, I think, Darrow, you're back to your question about cultures that are shaped by freedom. It's when you have true freedom, that is the freedom to make choices within God's moral order according to His law. Cultures thrive, right? Because you can govern, you can self-govern, you can make choices to govern creation, to do whatever God has put on your heart to do. This again, I think freedom is kind of a function of in the garden. God says, "I want you to rule. You rule over creation. Do something with it. Make something magnificent and beautiful." And to do that, you have to have freedom, right? In other words, you have to kind of be free to imagine, to create, to innovate, to invent. So these are all hallmarks of cultures that have been shaped by freedom. There tends to be incredible innovation, incredible prosperity, actually, as well. So,
but again, the implication is the freedom is within the framework of ordinances.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Of God's holy orders.
Yes, and of God Himself, right, yeah.
Yeah, you have the laws of nature, you have moral law. These are real.
They're real. Yeah, they're absolutely real.
In an atheistic universe, things that are non-material are not real.
Yeah. I mean, just to give a really basic example of this, Darryl, you talk about laws. There's God's moral law, the Ten Commandments, but there's also natural laws like the law of gravity. I mean, those are real laws, and they provide real limits. They are real constraints and limits. So you just imagine for a second you are flying in an airplane and you want to jump out the door of the airplane without a parachute. You're free to do that. That's a free choice, right?
But there are consequences.
But that freedom is kind of short-lived, right? You're until you hit the ground. That's the end of your freedom, essentially, because there is a limit or a constraint that law of gravity applies, creates. So we all live within these limits, and it's the same thing with a moral law. You can choose to abuse alcohol. That's a free choice. But you will become enslaved to that choice, as everyone knows who's an alcoholic. You no longer are free, So we can think about it in a very simple way, I think, that people can kind of understand or relate to. To be truly free, you have to live within these limits of, God's moral law and His physical or natural law as well.
Hi friends, I want to tell you real quick about how you can get your hands on an early release copy of this book, 10 Words to Heal Our Broken World. If you're interested, we would like to invite you to sign up for our book launch team. What is the book launch team, you ask? Well, it's an agreement between us and you that, number one, we will send you a free early released copy of this book in October. And then number two, in response, you will read the book and leave us an Amazon review upon its publication date. And if you really want to be a super fan, you can even share the book with a friend. To sign up for the book launch team, head to 10wordsbook.org. Again, that is 10wordsbook.org. And you can spell that either with the number or TEN. And by the way, as an insider tip, don't wait too long to sign up because there is only 100 spots available on this book launch team. To sum up, the first 100 approved signups will receive an advanced paperback copy of this book by mail, free shipping included. Participants are asked to read the book and prepare a rating and review on Amazon for the release of the book in November. To join, you must be a resident of the United States or Canada and have an active Amazon account. And we can only send one book copy per mailing address. And one last time, the link is 10wordsbook.org, and you can also find that link down in the show notes below.
Yesterday in the sermon, my pastor used the phrase same-sex marriage. And I almost leaped up and said, Pastor, you don't have same-sex marriage. That doesn't exist.
Yeah.
You have marriage, and that's between a man and a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And outside of that, it's not marriage. Call it something else.
Right.
And the same thing here with freedom.
Yes.
There is a definition of freedom, and part of that definition is you're free to choose within the boundaries of God's laws and ordinances.
That's right.
Anything outside of that is not freedom, and we should not call it freedom, because it's not freedom, it's slavery. You become a slave to your emotions. You become a slave to your choices.
Short-lived freedom.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
We see the outcomes of that and the results of that, which are not freedom. They're bondage. So I think this is a good segue to
Exactly.
Perhaps to the next question. Earlier when you talked about the redefinition of freedom in our contemporary culture, according to this false definition, what are some of the changes that we've seen that pull this false definition and impacts of that pull this false definition away from the true one?
What are some impacts, John, or what are some of the reasons for that?
Yeah, I mean, the freedom's been redefined in our contemporary culture according to this false definition of freedom of doing whatever we want, as opposed to being within God's limits. What are some of these changes, and I guess the impacts of them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that whenever you seek to define or to exercise freedom or choice apart from these, God-ordained limits, you quickly realize you yourself become kind of enslaved to your own passions, your own desires, your sin nature, and you move in the direction, as a people or a nation, you move in the direction of tyranny. So we're clearly seeing that, in the West, as the West has abandoned the biblical framework, it still uses this word freedom. In fact, I was struck by this, John. I watched a little bit of the Democratic convention, and they used the word freedom all over that convention. People had it on placards and banners. But it only actually, I was really thinking, what do they mean by freedom? How are they defining that word? And I thought they clearly don't support freedom of speech. They don't really even support freedom of conscience. They want to impose, and you see this, for example, with a person like Jack Phillips, who's this baker in Colorado, and he said, when he was being confronted by this, this homosexual couple, you will make a cake that celebrates homosexual marriage. He said that violates my conscience. Here, you go. There's other people that would be glad to make that cake. Don't make me make that cake. And they said, no, we don't respect that. You will, it's a cram down. You will do this, and if you don't, there'll be consequences. You'll be forced to pay fines. You'll be in violation of various state laws. So, there's no freedom of speech. They're happy to censor, and we saw this. We're seeing it right now. Just this huge fight over freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, you name it. So they don't mean freedom in that way. I think they mean freedom in only two respects: freedom to abort, your unborn child, to kill your unborn baby,
reproductive freedom,
and freedom to express your sexuality in any way you want. Now, those aren't freedom. Okay, that's not freedom for that baby. Let's take that example, right? I mean, you are treating that baby in the same moral way that you would treat a slave, that they're a non-person. So
this is why I would argue you don't call it freedom.
Well, I don't disagree with you.
You don't
I don't
call
disagree
it marriage.
with you, Daryl. Yeah. But that they are calling it freedom. It's just it's this
not.
Counterfeit. It's this redefined idea.
They're calling it freedom because freedom is such a powerful word, like compassion,
yes,
like justice, like equal justice. These are powerful concepts, and they use the powerful concept, but they've redefined it. And when they say freedom, they don't mean freedom, they mean license. It's the license to do whatever you want, whenever you want, outside of boundaries, because there are no boundaries.
Well, and it's not freedom because it leads to slavery.
That's
death.
right. That's why it's not freedom. But at that moment, it leads to chaos.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody does what is right in their own eyes, leads to chaos.
And tyranny, right.
Tyranny is the answer to the chaos.
Correct.
It becomes the excuse for chaos, because a nation cannot function where everybody does what is right in their own eyes. So how do you respond to that? You have to bring order, and that order is tyranny.
Well, this is why we wrote the book in some ways, Darrow, because in the same way, all of these words, justice, freedom, marriage, they've all been redefined to mean something that they are not. And so it's vital that we as Christians understand, what is this? What's the true understanding of this if we want to retain it or sustain it, especially in a free nation, a nation at least historically has been free. Because if we don't, if we can't get off the trajectory that we're on right now, we will lose it. We will, and we will lose it ironically in the name of freedom, right? This so-called freedom that isn't freedom, as you're saying, Darrow.
And part of what we need to do there, Scott, is exactly what your book is arguing for. We need to take words seriously, and not allow them to use the word freedom. We should not confirm that word, allow them to confirm the word freedom on what they're advocating, because it is not free. It's license. And when Christians in public, when you hear somebody say freedom and you hear what they're describing, no, that's not freedom. That's license.
Well, license meaning you're free to do whatever you want, but that it's really not even license, Darrow. It's slavery, is what it is.
Yeah, that's the other side. It's compelling on that side. It's not truly voluntary. When they want to use the word freedom, because freedom's a beautiful word with the right kinds of outcomes and the right definitions. But freedom to really compel someone to do something or to believe a certain thing, and when you communicate that you don't believe that, you believe in a different thing, to compel someone to something is just another form of bondage. It's not free at all. So that's the kind of change I think that we're seeing in society that's not healthy.
Yeah.
Mr. Miller, you're saying that we should not let them use that word freedom because what they really mean is license or bondage. Quite practically, how do we do that? With a lot of these 10 words, the problem with them is Christians are yelling, we want freedom. People they oppose Christianity are yelling, we want freedom, and yet they mean a completely different thing. Say I was at the DNC like we were talking about. Would I come up to someone and say, oh, you can't use the word freedom? That's my word. How do we practically do this? What you're saying is license. You need to switch your word. They're not going to do that. They love the word freedom because the word freedom comes with a lot of power. And I would argue that power comes from the Bible. But they like these words, freedom, love, justice, because they have a lot of weight to them and because people respect them. So how are we going to practically make them change their vocabulary on these words?
Well, just like I said about yesterday, I almost stood up in the middle of the service and said to the pastor, you don't say same-sex marriage. When you say same-sex marriage, you are agreeing with the new definition of marriage, and that is not marriage. This book on words is important because it's establishing what the real concepts are and what the counterfeits are. And we need to be willing to call out the counterfeits. Transgenderism. Call it out. Don't accept that as normal.
It's a reminding, maybe, Luke. Maybe that's one way, at least, we can remind people of what what the real and true definition is. Whether or not they accept it or not, or whether or not they push back against that, is under their own reaction and their own response. But it can be a reminder, and a firm reminder of what this freedom really means, and the intent behind it, and it's really meant to be others-centered and not self-centered.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. And I think my goal, and go ahead, Darryl. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
This is called, what John's saying here and what I'm saying is to speak prophetically to the culture. This is what prophets did. They told the truth to culture. And when we accept someone else's definition and let it go, we either use it or we don't challenge it, we're not being prophetic. So we need to speak prophetically when we hear in a Christian setting or outside of a Christian setting. We need to call it what it really is and not allow it to go under the auspices of freedom or compassion or justice, because it's not. Social justice is not biblical justice, as Scott so developed.
Yeah, and I think what my heart in this project is that I think when you use the same word, this is the deception of it, and Satan's behind all lies and deception, and so it's a very powerful tactic. You use the same word, but you hollow it out and give it a different meaning, and when you do that, you can even have followers of Jesus.
That's right.
Be caught up in this kind of false understanding, and so my heart is to say,
because it's a biblical word.
Yeah, Christian, understand what this word means. It's a really, really powerful concept, and we have to know it. We have to live it and uphold it or defend it, in the culture.
And not let them use that wonderful word illegitimately.
Or at least explain how it's been redefined in the culture, what this false cultural meaning is of freedom, which is...
and to point out when it's being misused. So
right,
that's right,
exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's the Bible is, in some respects, it's the narrative of the Bible. The story of the Bible is the story of freedom. It's how God created us free before the fall, how we lost freedom through the fall, by believing in this lie of Satan and violating that limit. And then it's a story of regaining the freedom, that reaches its culmination or its high point on the cross of Christ. But it's such I love looking at the scriptures through the lens of freedom. God created us to be free. It's lost, and then it's this kind of remarkable story, of regaining freedom. I think about the Old Testament, and God gave the law to Moses. They were enslaved before that in Egypt, right? So they were enslaved spiritually and politically. In every respect, they were slaves. God sets them free. He literally opens up the gates, and they go free into the desert, and then he gives them the law, because that's this is the thing that will keep you free. I love what Cecil B. DeMille, he was the director of that famous movie, The Ten Commandments. He said, I'm going to paraphrase his quote, God didn't give the law as some kind of cosmic killjoy moral constraint. No, he gave the law to keep them free. That was the very thing that was going to keep them free. And you see this in Deuteronomy when when Moses says to the people of Israel before they go into the promised land, in those powerful sections of the scriptures where he says, I've set before you life and death, blessings and curses. If you follow this law, this is the thing that will keep you free. You will be free. You will have life. If you abandon it, if you go and you choose, if you kind of go in the direction of this false freedom and license and serving other gods and doing, you will be enslaved again. So then he says, choose this day, right? And that choose, that's the essence of freedom. You choose. Mm-hmm. But there's this consequence if you don't accept that limit. And of course, Israel they weren't able to do that, so they found themselves enslaved over and over again, right, in Babylon and, whatnot. But
I want to underscore what you've just said, Scott.
Yeah.
They were enslaved.
Yes.
The easy thing for God was to lead them out of slavery. Mm-hmm. To take this people, to lead them through the flame in the daytime, the flame at night, and the smoking pillar in the daytime, to get them to the sea, part the sea. That was easy. Mm-hmm. It was easy to get him out of physical slavery. Mm-hmm. What was the harder part? Mm-hmm. The harder part was to get the slavery out of their mind. Mm-hmm. They were free physically from Egypt, but in their mind, they were still enslaved. They had a slave mentality. Now the hard part begins. And this is what you're describing in Deuteronomy. It's the story of the Pentateuch. How do you take a slave people and make them a free people? Yeah. Well, what did he do? He gave them the Decalogue, the moral law, because it is that moral law that creates the framework for building free societies.
Right. Exactly.
Amen.
And Darrow, it's important to say, we at one level we love our freedom. I mean, I love getting up in the morning and making a choice about what I want for breakfast or where I want to go on vacation or what I want to do with my life. I mean, those are precious things. But on another level, they're hard things. Freedom is not easy. And if you've ever talked to somebody who's been a slave or imprisoned for a long time, in fact, I remember this. If you saw that movie, The Shawshank Redemption, that famous movie, there's a really poignant part of that film where, it's a film about people that are in prison. And there was one guy who'd been in prison almost his whole life, and he was in his probably 70s, and he was, he served his time and was set free. But he couldn't, for all of those years he had been told what to do, what to eat, he couldn't handle the freedom. He just didn't know what to make of all of these choices that he had to do every day with his life, and he committed suicide. So, I mean, it's really sad, but it's a reminder that and if you've talked to people that have lived behind the Iron Curtain, I remember talking to some people that there was a kind of a like, it's nice that I don't have to make all these choices. I'm told who to marry. I'm told what kind of work to do. I'm told, and you even saw this with the Israelites when they came out of Egypt. They kind of wanted to go back at some level, at least we had food to eat. We didn't have any choices to make, but we have to take. Essentially, it's responsibility. Freedom comes with responsibility, and that can be a heavy burden as well. So,
and that is the thing we're seeking. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I love the connection between faith, freedom, and virtue. We will not choose to do things that are virtuous without a right understanding of freedom, and we won't have a right understanding of freedom, or more importantly, we won't have true freedom. Not only an understanding of it, but a true freedom that's not a freedom, that's not a bondage type freedom, unless we have the right understanding of faith and who God is and what He's given us, as we've said from the beginning, in this framework of not limitless freedom. We won't choose to do things that are virtuous and choose things that are helpful to others and all. We will choose license, and we've said the outcome John, of that is not good.
I think you see that so clearly with our founding fathers in the United States and their conception of what it meant for the United States to be a free nation. And our revolution versus the French Revolution might be good just to point that, because it really does get to the divide that you're talking about. Our founding fathers wanted a free nation, but they recognized that was only going to be possible where the citizens would govern themselves
based on God's laws.
Based on God's law, right? And, if they didn't, if they just did whatever they wanted to do, then you couldn't have a free people. It would be chaos, which would lead to a tyranny. And that's exactly what happened in the French Revolution.
And that's exactly where we are today.
Yes,
we are
exactly.
a people who are not self-governing.
Right.
We follow our noses. License is what we're after, to do whatever we want without responsibility. And this is why we see the West in decline. She is moving into disorder, away from God's order into disorder, and that creates a place for the state and tyrants to come in and impose godless order.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah, that's right. The beauty of this conception of freedom. In fact, Os Guinness, in his wonderful book Free People's Suicide, he talks about the triangle of freedom that our founding fathers understood, John, and that on one at the top of this triangle is you could see the true freedom. But for that freedom to be sustained, people needed to be virtuous, meaning they needed to submit to God's law and to govern themselves according to God's law. And this, by the way, let me just pause on that, because this is why Christ actually did set us free. The Bible says what's the famous passage? If you are in Christ, you are free indeed. Christ, because he lived the perfect life that we couldn't live, he completely obeyed God's moral law. He was completely free in that respect. And we, in our sinful nature, are not able to be free. We are sold in. The Bible uses this language of slavery. We're enslaved to sin and to Satan, and God, through Christ, redeemed us. He bought us back, and then he gives us this new heart and this desire to obey him, to be virtuous, to uphold his law, and the forgiveness if we don't. So he creates the conditions through the cross and the gospel for us to be spiritually free, which is the foundation for every other kind of freedom, political and otherwise. So we have that virtue, that ability to self-govern now through the power of Jesus Christ and the cross of Christ and the indwelling of his Holy Spirit. So we have that. But then Os Guinness says the third leg of that triangle is faith that can only be sustained through a deep religious faith, or a faith in Jesus Christ or God and his law, right? And then that leg ties up to freedom, and that can only be freely chosen. You can't impose that on somebody. That has to be, ultimately our faith has to be a freely chosen thing. It can't be imposed from the outside. So the founding fathers understood that that this freedom had to be within that kind of framework, and they were brilliant in that respect.
I am really enjoying this discussion, but we are running a little bit low on time. To sum up, I would like to try an analogy, and I know there's no such thing as a perfect analogy, but I think I've got one that works pretty good here, and I'm sure all my philosophical friends will hate me for this, but it's going to be a sports analogy. I love my sports analogies. As far as I can tell, when I'm looking at these two definitions and just listening to you guys now for 40 minutes, I think basketball, you can choose any sport.
Yep.
The sport I played for a long time is basketball. I understand it the most. But freedom is the ability to choose, what we ought within God's moral framework.
Yes.
That's the way we're explaining it here. Let's say God is the inventor of basketball. Okay, so he gets to choose what the framework is for how to play the game. He gets to choose the rules of what's right and what's wrong. He gets to choose where the out-of-bounds line is. He gets to choose that you should dribble and not travel and just carry the ball. He gets to choose those things. He set it up, and now he puts us into the game as the players. We're not playing soccer. We're not playing football. We're playing basketball. And as long as we stay within the rules, the rule book, there's a basketball rule book that God wrote, then we can enjoy this game and be free within it.
And it's very exciting.
No,
and
but that's a great analogy.
And there's a lot you can do.
Yeah.
I'm not done yet. This analogy keeps going. The problem is a lot of people are put into the basketball game and they don't understand that God made the game, and they don't understand that he made a rule book for the game. So they just blindly walk out of bounds, and then they get a penalty called, or they just blindly start walking with the ball and they get a travel called, and it interferes with them. It hurts them, where they're pushing against the moral framework that God has created for us. I remember when I was like 10 years old, this one game I kept getting this call called on me. And the ref would blow his whistle and he would make this motion with his hands, and I didn't know what it meant. And I was like, I'm just dribbling. What am I doing wrong? And no one explained to me that he was calling a carry, which is when you put your hand too far under the basketball while you're dribbling it, and you kind of carry it between dribbles instead of keeping your hand on top, just pushing down the ball. Anyways, I was so confused, and it was really frustrating. And if no one explained that I was breaking a rule, then I was like, you're inhibiting my freedom. Can I not dribble at all? Should I not touch the ball? Like, what am I doing wrong? And it's really confusing. And I think it's for that reason that a lot of non-believers have a really difficult time of figuring out how to live a flourishing life in this world, is because they don't know the rule book for the world. But then when people come to Christ, a lot of times they say, it's so freeing. It's so freeing to be a Christian. It really opens your eyes to how beautiful this life can be. And I think it's exactly that verse, John, you already shared it, but the truth will set you free, is Christians know the rule book, and they know the one who created the game that we live in. And because of that, we can explore the game in its fullness. There's a lot of freedom within the game, but you have to remember the rules. So anyways, I'm good.
It's a good analogy, Luke, because your analogy shows that when you disobey the rules, whether intentionally or not, you're ruining the enjoyment for yourself in the game. You're ruining the enjoyment and the freedom for the teammates, and you're ruining the enjoyment for the fans.
Yeah. Well, you ultimately can't. You can't play the game. It devolves into chaos.
Yeah. So you have the ability to choose. But if you choose the wrong thing, you're going to inhibit your freedom. You're essentially, destroying your freedom. But if you choose the right thing, then you have true freedom. And true freedom leads to more freedom.
But you need somebody to tell that kid, here's the rule. That's right. The compassionate thing to do. That's the loving thing to do for the kid. And who's that person that's going to speak to the kid so he knows the rules of the game?
Yeah. No,
it's
absolutely.
The coach or a teammate that knows more. That's the loving God.
That's right.
No, I think it's such a good, in so many respects, Luke, you're talking about any kind of game, there's rules, and you can't really play the game without those rules. You're not free to, but if you do, if everyone agrees to abide by those rules, there's incredible, you can do something magnificent. You can excel, and there's incredible beauty and power. Just think about basketball when it's played at its highest level.
Oh, it's incredible.
And I think that we're talking not about basketball. We're talking about life, and it's the same thing. This is the game of life, if you will. There's certain rules, and God established those rules, and when we abide by them, we flourish. I mean, we can excel at this incredibly high level because we're created to be free. That's how God created us. It's our image. It's part of what it means to be made in His image, and that's what God wants. He wants us to be free, truly free. And so I think it's just such a perfect analogy.
And when you are, like you said, Scott, you work to pursue excellence in basketball, and you get to that highest level.
Yeah.
You are beginning to touch something sacred.
Yeah, that's right.
When you see that basketball player that is at the height, they've disciplined their lives to be the best in basketball, and you see them make a shot, and you go, wow, how did they do that? Yeah. You're approaching holy ground at that point.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's holy, but I'm saying you're approaching something of perfection.
Yeah. Guys, we haven't talked about, an important element here. I think some people may be kind of wondering, because, it is tough. This is a very tough thing. This idea of freedom is very tough in one respect, because it runs up against the idea of God's sovereign authority, and if God is completely sovereign, how is it that we have free choices? I mean, and I know that that's a tough debate in theology. My only response, and I know time is running short, and that's a huge subject, but it's that both of those ideas are respected in the Scripture, and how they tie together or work together seems contradictory, but it's clearly not. And how we understand it, I think, is just it's hard, because we're finite and we're limited in our understanding just by nature of being created. We're not God. But both of those ideas are clear in the Scriptures. God is sovereign. We don't make choices that catch him by surprise. Oh gosh, I didn't realize you were going to do that. Now what am I going to do? He's not limited in any way by our choices or by Satan's choices, for that matter. He's sovereign, and yet he made us free. And we have this freedom to make choices. And are held responsible. In the book, I use the example of Joseph, the famous story of Joseph and his brothers, to illustrate this, where, they, because of their jealousy at that point in the story where they threw Joseph into the pit, intending to kill him, essentially leave him for dead, that was a choice. They made that choice. God, didn't restrain them, right? And yet, at the very end of the story, you see the brothers being reunited with Joseph in Egypt. And, it's a very poignant moment. Is he going to be angry, upset, bitter? And he makes that famous statement that what you chose, I think he even uses that word, what you chose for evil, God used for good, And this idea that God, even, he's greater than our choices. He can choose to bring good out of the evil choices that we make. But nevertheless, he respects our choices, and we will be held accountable. There will be a judgment seat, and we see this in Revelation. There will be judgment where all that we've done, all of our actions and our thoughts, all of our choices will be held up and judged against his law, and we'll be found guilty of violating the law, and we'll be, having to pay the punishment or the consequences of that unless we cry out for mercy. Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. And then that punishment is paid for by Christ. But yeah, there's again a ton to say about that. But I just think it's important for Christians. Bottom line, you got to uphold both of those. Thoughts on that, guys, as we wrap up?
That's right. Well, I think it comes down to understanding that what you said earlier, Scott, we're made in God's image. And when we have that humble posture before him, we want to do things that please him. We want to know him. We want to know his word. And we will choose the right kinds of things to live the right kind of things in freedom. We'll make mistakes. We'll make mistakes every day, but at least we'll have the right trajectory in our lives. And I love Psalm 37:4, delight yourself in the Lord, and he'll give you the desires of your heart. This is not saying that he will grant our licenses. This is saying that he will change our hearts so that we have good desires that are consistent with his word. But if we as society remake God in our image, then all limits are off, and we have these terrible consequences and these freedoms that are no freedom at all. They're bondage.
Yeah, no, it's just such a critical time for us in the West, because we have a legacy, a heritage of freedom, spiritual freedom through Christ and the cross, and political freedom, because Christians, faithful Christians through centuries, through the Magna Carta, and you name it, have lived out the implications of true freedom and created free nations. But those free nations can only be sustained by obedience to the law, to the respect for the limits. That's the moment we're in. We're no longer doing that, and we will lose our freedom. That it's for sure we will become enslaved. We will become, our free nations will become tyrannies. We're moving that direction. So I think all that to say, it's really critical that the church, we as followers of Jesus Christ, understand true freedom and work hard and pray hard and live it out in our own lives to sustain it at this moment, or it'll be lost. It's very fragile. So
true.
I think that's a good place to wrap up, and that's a good call to action for all of us this week. As you guys heard me say during the commercial today, we have some big announcements for the book as of today. First and foremost, if you want to get your copy of the book, 10 Words to Heal Our Broken World, for free, we have given you a chance to do that by joining the launch team for the book. If you would like to join the launch team, all you have to do is go to the webpage for the book, which, by the way, has all things 10 Words to Heal Our Broken World on it. That page is under the URL 10wordsbook.org, 10wordsbook.org. Again, you can use the number 10 or just TEN, whatever you want. Those will both take you to the webpage. On that page, you will find right away the place to sign up for the launch team, and there is obviously a little bit of a quid pro quo to the free book. Once you get the book, we would ask for you guys to leave a review on Amazon's and then Goodreads as well if you also use that site. So that's how you can join the launch team. You can do that today. By the way, there is only 100 spots open on that team, and they are filling up. So make sure to go and do that right away if you would like a copy of this book. As I've told you here on the other episodes of this series, we're hoping for you guys to not only listen to this podcast, but also be inspired to share this message with more people. These words really matter, and I think this book will be extremely helpful for our time and for people just for Christians to understand the true definitions of these words. That seems like that's our application at the end of every one of these episodes. We need to know these words as Christians, and we need to not only know them, but champion them. And this book will be a really helpful resource for anyone who is interested in doing that. So we hope that you guys can continue to help us promote this message by sharing about the book, sharing about this podcast series, going to 10wordsbook.org and learning more ways to share the message as well. So thanks again for listening today to the word freedom. We will be back with you guys soon for another episode. And this podcast is called Ideas Have Consequences. So thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you next week.